In some ways, right? Like, I think that we're going to be slower to adapt to climate change than we think. Even with American, like, we're going in ultra speed. People don't realize what's ahead. It's not just say we can retrofit and we'll make it. No, there's going to be mass global population movements, particularly from like developing countries, which is going to create crises in developed countries in terms of immigration, in terms of resources. And, even if we become carbon neutral now, we still feel the effects of the last 10 years. So we won't really know. So it's just going to get incrementally worse. So in some ways, there's going to be a massive change, right? And that's scary. And that's kind of the reality, right? It's dark.
Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of Climb by VSC. I am your host, Jake Kapoor, and today I am really excited to be joined by another New Yorker like me, chatting about the future of New York and the sustainable future of New York. My guest today is Sander Dolder, SVP of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. That's a lot of very long acronym, Sander. We're going to unpack that in a second, but it's a nonprofit that supports entrepreneurship in New York City to help deliver sustainable infrastructure, among many things. So, Sander, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you for inviting me here.
Yeah, so before we dive into all that, help me unpack the Economic Development Corporation. What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, it's kind of a unique setup in the context of, at least in the US side of things, there's a lot there. And some of these models exist more in Europe. And basically, it's a quasi governmental group. They're
Mm,
technically a nonprofit. The president of EDC is appointed by the mayor.
okay.
So there's like a layer that's political, but for the most part, we're agnostic. And really, there's a couple things we do, right? We were created in the 90s with really the idea of the federal government turned over a lot of properties in New York City to the city.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, the whole first, say, like 20 years of EDC was really to repurpose a lot of those properties. A lot of them were old industrial sites. There's on Governor's Island, it was National Guard
Yeah.
station. And so that's been usually the first part of EDC was that retrofitting and sort of repurposing a lot of those assets. The first thing we got known for was completely, and for better or for worse, redo Times Square
Yeah.
in the 90s. So it kind of changed in there and more into sort of this amusement park, which as a New Yorker, you probably don't go up there that much.
Yeah.
Um, but that being said, after 2008, when the recession came, it was clear that New York City's economy was overly indexed in the financial services industry.
Yeah.
And that posed a risk overall for New York. And so the idea was to create a group that plainly diversified the economy. And so that's the group I'm in. And
Mm-hmm.
so there wasn't much prompts beyond that. But really, the way we look at it is a couple fold. One, where do we want New York City's economy to be 2 to 5 years from now?
Yep.
And we go backwards and think about, do we want to invest in some of these new emerging sectors, right? Where we feel New York will play a role and be a powerful player on a
Yep.
global stage? How do we rethink shifts in industry with competitive industries, so fashion or media, where there's a lot of global competition to sort of take a piece of that. Um, and then also, think about manufacturing and some of those legacy industries on how do you sort of modernize it for the industries of tomorrow.
Yep.
And so my role overall there is really within that realm, but really thinking about the climate transition and how do we build the industries tied to that.
Yeah.
And so that there's a lot there, and I'm happy to
Yeah. Yeah.
unpack it.
We're gonna unpack that in a
Yeah.
second. So, how did you find yourself? It's a very unique role inside of, I think, what is a very unique organization inside a pretty unique city, right? There's really no city like New York that operates like New York with the density that we have, the population that we have. So, how did you find yourself in this role?
Yeah. So partially luck, partially networks. I was in graduate school. I went to University of Michigan for grad school, did a dual MBA and a master's of sustainable systems. Basically, before going to grad school, I thought about how do I merge some of the environmental justice work I did on the side with I was in consulting, like management
Mm,
consulting.
yep.
And And so I looked at some of the programs at the time. There was Duke, Yale, and Michigan were really the ones who had a little bit of these 2 degrees that are 3 years instead of four.
Right.
And you're kind of working at the center of those two problems. And I like Michigan's program because it's a little bit more private sector focused.
Mm-hmm.
All that said, I ended up going there. It was great. I come out of it, and with a lot of people in my cohort, which is about 30 per year at the time,
Yeah.
a lot of them went to the West Coast, right? Or like to say like Rocky Mountain Institute or some of these big NGOs that are doing really interesting things, or they go to a corporate venture group and work the problem from the inside
Yes.
there. Uh, and what I kind of thought of was, okay, got some of these skills. The one thing I don't have is any sort of public sector experience. And if we're going to do this thing, you kind of need them to be
Yeah.
along for the ride because it's infrastructure, because there's permitting, because a lot of policies are set at the different
Yeah.
governmental levels.
Yeah.
So on one hand, there was that, right? That realization. Then the other piece was I wanted to come back here. And I also thought like there was like a lot of opportunity here for doing big things that don't exist yet,
Yeah.
right? It's
Yeah.
kind of like there was like not a blank canvas because I would say New York City has always been pretty good at setting environmental policies
Mm-hmm.
and sort of being more in the forefront of that. But then in terms of the mechanics of how do you build those industries, I thought there was an opportunity there. And at the same time was Mayor Bloomberg at the time very much was a figure that was thinking about how do we bring more of the tech sector here? How
Yeah.
do we build New York City's version of the tech sector?
Yeah.
And so they did things like Cornell Tech and things like that. Anyway, I was connected through a contact of mine with someone who worked at the EDC. And we chatted, and he was like, hey, you want to come on as an intern? And I thought, okay, I'll do this as like a 2 month thing, two,
Sure.
3 month thing and see where it goes. Right. And I already had like some other offers they
Yeah.
were like more like felt safe. And this felt like, okay, this is new. I could learn a lot. So I go in there, um, turns into a full-time thing.
Yeah.
At that point, I'm like, oh, it's going to be 2 year thing. And then I'm going back in the private sector.
Right.
There's only so much of
Right.
bureaucracy I can handle. But, 3 administrations later, I'm still there. Right. So it's
Yeah.
like 10 years. I'm reaching sort of the end of my tenure, but it's been a fascinating sort of part of what kept me there in that vehicle is because you were sort of you're working on problems at a macro level in a city like New York that's not, let's just say, 9 million people. Government in New York is quite centralized compared to, say, a London or Tokyo.
Yep.
And so it's a centralized government that's sizable, right? Size of a lot of countries. And um, and so there's a certain power behind that, right? To be able to do things. At the same time, it was clear that there's just a ton to learn, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
great place to. You're sort of at a crossroads, right? And so people go in and out, and you get to meet just different vantage points from
Yeah.
government to corporates to the startup ecosystem to academia to workforce development to community organizations.
Yep.
They each play a role. And like that to me has been really fascinating. Like, how do you fix that systems problem?
Well, that's
Uh,
actually what excited me to have you on because so much of what we have seen investing in, let's call it broadly climate technology,
mhm,
right? What does that even mean these days? It's kind of touches
sure.
everything. Climate is touching every industry, but the other thing that it's touching is local government. So many of these projects, because they have to exist in the real world, have to interface with laws that have been written around the land they use or the resources they access. And that is kind of against the ethos of how, say, Silicon Valley, but broadly the tech sector builds, right? Think of Uber, think of Airbnb. It's the move fast and break things and try
Mhm.
to stop us and see what happens kind of vibe. And it's different now. That's the biggest shift that I've seen. So where does your role fit in kind of enabling that, call it exchange or access of New York City resources? And I'm using kind of broad terms here because that can mean a lot of things where does your role fit in enabling that access between the private and public sector?
Yeah, a lot of it is you can kind of write your own narrative in a way
Mm,
because you're kind of at a point where you problem solve, right? Like my job is to problem solve, right? And so we identify where gaps exist in the ecosystem. So on one hand, it's, as I mentioned, investing in building certain sectors, and that can mean innovation,
yep.
right? How do we invest in, and should we invest in accelerators or incubators or innovation hubs or co-working spaces within tech or mobility or whatever? So that's one kind of
Yep.
vertical. Um, Another vertical is around workforce, right? How do we build the talent? How do we make sure that New Yorkers get access to these jobs? How do we sort of address the sort of gaps that are going to happen with the climate transition, right?
Yep.
Like you need people trained in order to implement this infrastructure. And then the last piece on that end of building industry, and again, there's a lot of other pieces
Hmm.
within this. I'm generalizing it. The last piece is around infrastructure. So
Yeah.
we happen to own a lot of land and manage it, but a lot of it is could be, so things think of like, can we help facilitate the installation of a substation because of all the offshore wind that's happening?
Yeah.
Can we, use some of our properties for staging for offshore wind? So we're doing that with Equinor down in South Brooklyn Marine Terminal.
Hmm.
Huge waterfront property is going to turn into, I think it's the biggest offshore wind port in the US, or it's
Really?
going to be. So,
Wow.
so it's pretty sizable. So that's one piece, right? How do you sort of build the industry? The second piece is taking the view, turning from the industry side all the way to the government side. So then now we're looking at New York City's government. It's giant. Some might say it's bureaucratic. Uh, and it's complicated, right? Like I've been there 10 years and I still find new groups that exist within that,
Yeah.
right? It's just a giant machine. And with any giant machine, and I think maybe Obama said this when he was talking about the federal government, it's like a cruise ship, right? And like you can only, even if you're like the president, you can only steer it so much, right? It's a slow moving thing. There's a lot of other pieces. It's infinitely complicated. And so like any one person can't really do that much
Hmm.
change. And so it's all that's to say, on one hand, it brings stability, which is probably a good thing. On the other hand, it makes it hard to change because it's just complicated.
Yeah.
And so what we kind of look at is, okay, you have all these big agencies. We're kind of a 500 people sized organization. We're kind of cut across everything, and we are semi-independent, so we can move faster. We have more flexibility in terms of procurement, in terms of rules,
Yeah.
um, in terms of hiring. Um, and what that does is it allows us to go in oftentimes to build new parts of the government or help work with certain groups in the government to change their how they're configured
Yeah.
in order to enable them to be more receptive to some of the, say, industry needs or
Well, give me
how
give me give
things
me
are
an
going.
example because
Yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
hearing that you're speaking in generalities,
So
but
so
it's a
so
little bit
so so
abstract,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So like let's break it down. So let's take something that deals with startups, right? So on one hand, you brought this up around Uber, right? Uber comes in town, um, they grow here, city doesn't take a position, just sort of like ignore it.
Yeah.
Then it gets too big of a problem that they have to do something,
Yep.
right? Which is what happened. Problem is at that point in time, a company like Uber is big enough
Hmm.
that they have a lobbying team, that they have a certain level of power, they have a certain level of consumer adoption, that there's less leverage
Of course.
for a government. And part of it is like if you look at like all these city agencies, like they are already short staffed. They are already doing more than, they're basically like their head above water, right?
Hmm.
And they have to keep things going, right?
Hmm.
It's like it's 24/7 machine. You have to make sure that people get access, that transportation works, all these things. So those are their priorities. So thinking about they know what needs to happen in the future, but they can't really spend time thinking about that. They don't have those teams. So what we do is like, for instance, with so like take that Uber example. That's one disruption to, say, a urban setting.
Yep.
There's going to be a lot more, right? And so with the climate transition, for instance, what that looks like is, can we work with battery storage companies and bring in, say, the fire department? Can we bring in the Department of Buildings? Can we bring in the Department of City Planning and work with, say, the startup ecosystem to pilot a bunch of those solutions, right?
Yeah.
But part of it is, of course, we want to help these companies, and that's sort of a business development kind of
Right.
plan. It helps them prove their product, whatever. But on the other hand, it's you're educating city officials on where things are going,
Yeah.
and you help break down the silo where a startup or a company might not understand why certain policies are in place. Similarly, fire chief might not understand some of the technologies and where it's going.
Yeah, or
And
or the benefits from, moving your vehicle fleet to electric, or accessing, different kinds of,
yeah,
I don't know, off-grid
so
power.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So on
Yeah.
one hand, it's that breaking down the silos to kind of do that,
Yeah.
right? And you start seeing change happen,
Yeah.
right? You start finding champions within these agencies that are willing to take the helm for what comes next,
Yeah.
right? Because it's one thing, but then next year it's going to be another thing, and then another thing, another thing. And so, how do you increase the rate of innovation, the rate of adoption of new innovations within government? So that's one piece,
Yeah.
right? And then, I think um, the other piece will be really that you want the government side of things to eventually run these things on their own. So we
Mhm.
kind of help facilitate. We tend to run these programs. But what will happen is now, and so this is an example with the DOT, the Department of Transportation. We have we help create New Lab, right, which is an innovation hub in the Brooklyn Navy
Yep.
Yard. We were, trying different things with them over the years, different programs, like what would work, what would help startups. And, eventually the DOT wanted their own studio. And so the idea is like, how do you build these innovation engines for all these different government entities? And it's
Yep.
starting to happen.
Yeah.
You're starting to see a bunch, but there's still a lot more to do. And eventually, where you want it to go, not only from doing this sort of like kumbaya, break down the silo, but you want to start driving towards a more proactive policy making.
Mhm.
And so, like that, if you work with earlier companies, you have more leverage, but you also get to make better decisions on a policy side.
Yeah.
And so, with say the DOT, they were conservative about bringing e-bikes to New York, but what they did was they did pilots across the outer boroughs. They got a lot of data out of it. They got to understand what's safe, what's not safe, what's a better way to design the streets for it, what's a
Yeah.
better way to sort of manage it. How do you deal with theft? How do you deal with battery
Yep.
replacements? Like all these things. So it gives them a way to understand that and build policies around it. So when you're actually scaling it across a city of 9 million, that you have a better understanding of how it's going to go
Yeah.
and a little bit more control. And so that's sort of where we're
Yeah,
where
and I
it's
mean,
going.
it helps. I'm really happy to hear you say that, because I think it helps policymakers hear from their constituents, and their constituents are these businesses, these startups, right? I've been in the city almost 15 years. I firmly believe, like, this coming decade, this is the best city to build a business. And I spend quite a bit of time in San Francisco. It's not San Francisco anymore. Maybe there's still opportunity there, but I think we fundamentally think like there's a lot of opportunity here, and the policymakers should hear from those startups. The challenge that I think those startups, and some in my portfolio have expressed the same thing, is oftentimes you don't know who to go to.
Right.
And to your, I guess, ask or request that we want to catch the pace of adoption and the pace of innovation up to the pace at which things move inside of government. I mean, these two things are very in
It's very
contrast
different.
with each other.
Right.
So how can we bridge that gap? Like, what is the missing link to help bridge that pace gap
Yeah, yeah,
effectively?
yeah. So, I mean, you're never gonna fully do that, right? Because same with a corporate. A big corporate is gonna be slower moving,
Yeah.
right? That's why they're not as oftentimes not as innovative, or it's harder for them to sort of transform. Um, issue with government that makes it hard is that you're a public servant to the people, right? And so there's an election piece to it. There's
Mm,
like an appearance, an optical kind of an optics piece where that sometimes builds some guardrails around what you can and you can't do. So on one hand, there's that piece, right? So just to understand that like it's never gonna fully be as fluid,
yeah.
but there's ways to improve it,
Yeah.
right? And I guess on the way to improve it, and I'll touch on I should have made this point last time, just like a minute ago. But one thing is, it's a city of 9 million people. So historically, when you procure something, say for like NYCEDC residents, I think it's roughly 400,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a lot of infrastructure, building infrastructure. If you're going to change all the HVAC systems, right, and you're going to do it all at once, startups are not going to be able to bid.
Yeah.
You know, that is like Siemens and Schneider Electric and like some of the Johnson
You
Controls,
need
like
scale to be
the
able to
big
serve that.
companies can
Yeah.
do it, right? Which is okay, right? Sometimes, but honestly, that kind of cuts out a lot of like potentially better solutions, and also potentially to help New York City's economy, right? Like
Yeah.
with homegrown solutions,
Yep.
right? And so there's always going to be a layer of procurement and competitiveness. Like you want to be able to evaluate which one's the best option. What we're trying to do is get to what we call internally pilot to scale,
Okay.
right? So like it's similar to that DOT example. You take four different competitive products, right? And in the e-bike world, there's no like Honda or
Mm-hmm.
Toyota or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It's like smaller. I mean, Lime is pretty big now, but
Yeah.
like relatively small compared to a Siemens or some of these big players. You pilot them and then you figure out which one's the best solution to scale, right? The trick is where it gets harder is around the procurement because sometimes, and this is where we're working, trying to figure that out, is can you scale a solution that's piloted as a method of saying like you actually procured it? Because was it competitive,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so like there's regulations there around it's not like the private sector where you can be like, this is the best company, so I'm going to partner with them.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
Like there's like hurdles and so you can't get rid of that because that's sort of what creates corruption in government if you don't create certain
Yeah. You have to have an
transparency
open
and
bidding
open bidding.
process. Yeah.
But is there ways to accelerate it, right? And so that's sort of where we see it like you're beta testing a product, you improve it based on whether what you observe the design issues are in say New York City,
Yeah.
the company solves for that, and can you scale then that across the board?
Yeah.
So I think on one hand there's that, right? Um, but then it gets more complicated when you're talking about bigger sets of infrastructure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that gateway tunnel that they want to build for Amtrak, that requires federal money because it's in the billions of
Yeah.
dollars, and that requires a lot of time to sort of pitch it and get your representatives and prioritizing in government, which is tricky because, there's a million issues.
Yeah.
So why would this startup be that important in the millions of things that the city has to address?
Well, I think the other aspect, so procurement is, I think, an absolutely valid kind of challenge. Zoning and permitting is something that
Mhm,
also comes up quite a
mhm,
bit. And I always think of it in the context of, look, there are some startups that are, relying on the city of New York, or let's just, their local government as customers. And then there are those that are operating within the rule set that has been created for them by this government. They are using New York City roads, or they are working with buildings that are based in New York City, and they want to replace HVAC, or they want to, create some sort of other geothermal access to energy. And yet, I'll give you an exact example. Frank was on this couch. Frank Rieg, who's the CEO of Revel, was on this couch not too long ago, and he said to me, when we initially started out, and we knew we would have to work closely with the city of New York, I had to go find advisors who had worked with, Car2Go and bikes and all this kind of stuff, because I needed to understand from them how to navigate New York City government, New York City politics. And I, as a taxpayer of New York, say, why did he have to do that? Why isn't there a place where startups can go in New York and say, hey, I am here. I fundamentally want to make New York better, want to bring EVs, or, whatever your startup's example is. And yet it's almost designed to be siloed and insular, which then allows incumbents, not startups, to succeed. Is that something that you've been there 10 years now? Is that
Mhm.
something you've seen changing? And how has it
100%.
changed?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, basically, what we're trying to do is be the conduit for that,
Yeah.
right? Like, can we be the gateway that allows us to bridge the gap between, those harder to navigate offices, right? Because like we work with startups, we're more experimental, we're more willing to take risks on new programs and
Yeah.
trying out things. All the other groups, as I mentioned, are like barely above water, like they don't have time for that, right? And so it's like that's like priority 12 for them. And so even though it's an exciting technology and solution, it might make sense, it might be the future, you know,
It's not even,
people's houses
yeah.
are burning, right? And
Yeah.
like things like that. So, um, what we're trying to do is, and this is sort of what's happening in real time. And I will say that administration to administration that changes, right? Like the vibe of how those things are. And so that plays a factor into it as
Yeah.
well, right? I think on one hand, um, before I kind of get into that and break it down, like there's what I see is like most of my group has worked in the private sector before.
Okay.
That's not the case in most of government. You have like government people, you have private sector people. Most people I've talked to in private sector have never worked in the public sector, right? And that's a problem in a way, right? Because like you're not going to understand it. Like, why should it, like the public sector is built a certain way, constructed a certain way? Private sector's built a certain way, and it's like more the capitalistic system, all this kind of
Yep.
stuff. Uh, it's going to be hard to sort of understand it if either party has never spent time working with each other, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is we're like, for instance, me, I'm out and about. I talk to different kinds of stakeholders, and that's sort of what I mentioned at the beginning. Most most government officials are in their offices designing policies, sometimes in a vacuum
Yeah.
historically. Now it's changing a little more, right? Now it's kind of moving towards we're trying to connect those dots. We're working with the Department of Buildings, we're working with the Department of City Planning, of thinking, could there be zones for rapid permitting
Yeah.
across New York? Could there be change? How do we bring change towards, say, our capital dollars? So, for instance, if we say X developer, we're going to give you a loan to build this development. Now, there's a catch. Like on one hand, there's some diversity and equity requirements. Like we want you
Yeah.
to sort of like, give some of that funding to MWB organizations, things like that. And then on the sustainability side, can we start saying like part of your construction needs to be 5% recycled concrete, needs to include X, Y, and Z measure. And so we're starting to play with that, right? We're starting to think about what that can look like, how it's possible. Because again, like for us, we're kind of like it's easier to do it for us than
Yeah.
say the full city agency. Because once the Department of City Planning or the Department of Buildings adopts it, then it becomes like
The lay
across
of
the
the land.
board.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that e-bike example. It's like, can we be sort of the guinea pigs for it
Mm-hmm.
to help sort of do that? And it's the same thing with say piloting,
Yeah.
right? Like we're doing that now. You're starting to see in the early days piloting. It was just impossible to do. So we would work through business improvement districts. We figured this out. No one told us. We had to sort of, it's like a puzzle. But what we found out is like business improvement districts have sometimes a lot of their own jurisdiction in terms of rules, trash pickup, a lot of these kind of things, access to infrastructure.
Yeah.
So a company could start working with them. So in New Lab, for instance, or in Company Ventures, which we have a partnership as well, we would put these companies to pilot with these bids because it was
Mm-hmm.
like easy to do. And then we didn't have to deal with like permitting on our end.
Yeah.
And also, I should say at the time, like even our leadership wasn't necessarily 100% on board with like, hey, let's work with the Department of Buildings and change stuff. This administration is very much into that, right? Very
Mm-hmm.
much into like, how do we enable, right? How do we kind of move this forward? And And so that's sort of where we are really trying to position it, right? Can we sort of help move the dial and set the example for the rest of the city to follow, right?
Yeah.
And we can absorb the risk when they really can't, right? They
Yeah.
they can't. They have to keep heating in the public housing. They have to
They
keep
don't even
water
have the
running,
staffing
and they don't have the staffing. There's
like
so many shortages
even
now.
accept those requests.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's sort of where it's a complicated problem. We can be that conduit.
Yeah.
But we also have like a million projects going on.
I'm
So
sure.
that's
Yeah.
always a challenge.
You made a point there that I want to touch on that I think is kind of interesting because you hear the libertarian set of, Silicon Valley or even investors here in New
Yeah.
York talk about the challenge of the IRA or other legislation like this that's passed, and you hinted at it at sort of a local level, when you are creating a policy, you then or doing an allocation of dollars, there is a coupling of it with social
Mhm.
justice, socioeconomic, and it gets called or even labor training, right? That was a big part of the IRA.
Mhm.
That a big part of the dollars has to go to
Or
retraining
manufacturing
or
requirements or
manufacturing.
things like.
Are we doing ourselves a disservice by bundling these things together when really the goal is we want to have better building materials so that they're not emitting, better cars on the road so that they're not emitting? Like, help me understand the case for
Yeah, yeah.
bundling those things.
Yeah. I mean, look, obviously the libertarian viewpoint will be let the market dictate the terms, right? It's a
Yeah.
capitalistic country. It's supposed to be working that way. Yeah, it's a capitalist country, and I certainly think that in the US, um, what takes 5 years now in Europe will take 2 years here with the climate transition because it goes from 0 to 150% here. It's like never like this proactive, slow kind of governmental response like you've
Right.
seen in Europe where they invest in it. Now, it's also not like full blown um, you know, system where it's just 100% market driven. I mean, the government, if the government's going to give low interest loans, if the government's going to give out money that is people's money, taxpayers' money, right? It's not gonna, business is one part of it,
Yeah.
right? But like a lot of people don't care about that. A lot of people care about what's happening in their neighborhood. Um, and you have to find ways to sort of help solve for that. Now, I would love to say that like decoupling these things will drive towards that, but you got to push people to change. And like honestly, like people aren't going to change if you don't start like trying to move the dial a little bit because they'll only change when we talked
Yeah.
um no one really cared about climate until like around the pandemic,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Here for the most part. I mean, I've been in a circle where we were like in just a more niche, more sort of tight knit, but it's exploded. Why it's exploded? Because there's money
Of
involved,
course.
right? There's subsidies. And so like I understand that, but like we're not just gonna give the money for free out. We're gonna say like there's a catch. If you give low interest loans out, right? That's the competition. I think it's healthy when the private sector and the public sector have a healthy competitive market. Um, and sort of the reverse example to that, to say like a libertarian would say, like, hey, look at Amtrak, right? Yeah, it was a problem. Now that's why you have Brightline. I think having Brightline out there is a good thing
Mm-hmm.
because it sort of forces all those groups to change.
Yeah.
And so we're one player among many, right? If you don't like those incentives, find another way to do it.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how I feel like there's a role for government to help move the dial because part of our responsibility is to educate the general population and to make and get the general population involved in this space. It won't happen altruistically like that, right? So, for instance, when an example is we brought Equinor to one of our properties, South Brooklyn Marine Terminal.
Mm-hmm.
Part of their lease is terms, right? We can control rent terms to a certain extent,
Yeah.
right? And so it's favorable rent. You're not going to get that kind of rent from a private developer. It's just not going to happen. So, like, great, we'll give that great opportunity, but there's a catch. You're gonna you're going to create an innovation fund and you're going to create a community fund, and you're going to have a board and you know some Equinor people, some people from EDC, some community people, others, and you're going to figure out how to give some of that money out to do those things because those
Mm-hmm.
things are important to us. And it's not
Mm-hmm.
just like we want you to come here. It's like, okay, we'll give you a favorable deal, but those are the catches because those catches are important to sort of move things forward.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get that kind of funding. Like you got to realize that there's limited amount of funding in government, and like we won't be necessarily be able to do these innovation projects or these uh inclusivity projects to sort of get communities involved if we don't have money to do it. And so this is a method what
You
as
have to
well to
build that private partnership to get those dollars in order to do these initiatives.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
so in the same way as like giving a low interest loan, it allows us to do many things that are important to New Yorkers
Yeah.
without without necessarily having to find separate money and separate things, which is just not easy. It's
Yeah.
not easy when
Yeah.
there's 12,000 priorities as a city, right?
Yeah, totally. You mentioned the US model of going 0 to 150%. I think it's so true when you think about, the IRA was 30 years in the making, and the folks that have been working on some of these
Mhm.
policies have been at this for a while. But when it passed, I mean, just in the last, 2 years, from when it was kind of in the chambers of debate to getting passed to where we sit today, a year, plus past it, it has been a massive explosion. Then you have the European model where things are a little bit more incremental. They're happening slowly. They feel to me a little bit siloed. I mentioned I was in Copenhagen and in Sweden, and you know, there's a lot of public dollars allocated to private funds to back startups, but they all have requirements around, X% must be within Sweden or Norway or Finland or however it is. Then there's the Chinese model, very top down. They move really quickly, especially when it comes to infrastructure. I'm giving you this long preamble to say, in your experience, having kind of been sitting at this intersection of public and private, looking at other countries and other cities, who's doing it really well out there? Who can New York learn from to say this is a model that really bridges that public and private relationship well?
Right. Great question. I think that sort of spans across innovation generally.
Okay.
I mean, I think climate is a good example because it requires government
Yes.
participation. Um, let's start more with like the Chinese model, which is like extreme compared to say a Japan and Korea, but they're along that path. They're kind of a mix between what's happening here in the US and sort of the top down decision making where you can scale things really quickly, although sort of adapting might be more of an issue there. So on one hand, for scaling, yes, you have solutions that exist and you need to iterate on those
Hmm.
solutions. Chinese model is great for that. If you want a model where you innovate very quickly and be able to problem solve, like the US is the best market for that. And I'll go into it a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah, yeah.
And then in Europe, they tend to be more proactive and sort of funding research. The main issue in Europe is one that US is a unified country, right? So the EU still has like
That's sorry, that's funny. The US is a unified country in terms of a public operating model, not
yeah,
in
but
terms
even
of
culturally, I think
yeah.
it's just more transparent here. Like in Europe, it's the same stuff. There's like far right, far left, like
Yeah.
all of that stuff too, right? I think, yeah, I mean that's a separate
Okay,
conversation, but
sure.
yes,
Okay.
but it's unified in terms of when it comes to look, the governor of Governor Kemp from Georgia went to Germany to sell the IRA.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
because he knows there's dollars associated for his state. It's going to be growth. Sure, he doesn't really care about climate change, at least politically. I don't know about personally, but they're outselling. So in that sense, it's unified. Like
Yeah.
whether
I
it's
understand your
yeah,
point. Yeah.
and so and in Europe, there's a challenge because of that, right? Like now they're scrambling to figure out what their IRA is going to be there,
Mhm.
and that's a problem. Is they have a problem there to try to figure
There's
out how that's going
real
to work.
economic disparity between countries, and then you have to talk about how they,
Yeah, and they're all in
allocate
different
dollars
languages
together.
and
Yeah.
bureaucracy, and they have different needs, and like it's like not as standardized in
Right.
some way.
Right.
Um, and not as capitalistic, right? So there's like even more stuff like, oh, we have to think about like privacy, which is a separate conversation, but like privacy concerns, like it's the same thing. There you have to, there's really strict regulations, you have to get consent, all this stuff for like even if you take pictures at an official political event, to like all this kind of stuff where here like they don't, no one
Yeah.
cares
Who cares?
as much, right? So on one part is that, right? Like just the bureaucracy, the a lack of standardization because of so many countries, different cultures, all of this kind of stuff. Then on the other hand, um, which is a big thing, to me, it's the biggest thing when it comes to the startup world is they're great at like you go to some of these universities there, they have really fantastic research. Problem is they're not good at commercializing. But they're not good at commercializing because society there, and there's a lot of reasons why, but society there, and this is coming from someone who grew up in Switzerland, um, is not the business culture doesn't allow risk taking there. That's the
Mhm.
biggest thing. So there's a failure to fail. And so there's when you build a company, you want to build the perfect solution instead of like iterate, fail,
Get an
iterate,
MVP out and test it.
yeah, 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 and
Yeah.
like get that. And so
Yeah.
US is really good at that, right? And that's sort of why, for instance, with like the smartphones, right? Europe, it was always bigger. They were more, they had more incentives. They had better, less monopolistic sort of tendencies when it comes to the cellular companies there. So the smartphones were more adopted there than here. But then here, Apple and Google came with the OS because they knew that's sort of like the central piece to where the phones are going.
Yeah.
And within a couple of years, they completely dominated globally because US is good at designing software, things that are easy to navigate for a wide variety of people.
Yeah.
And I think it's because the integration works better here.
Mm.
US is, or in Europe, is still a lot of different cultures that are monocultures across the board. And, you go from anything from like Germany, where if you buy a car and you have their BMW app, just like you can basically customize everything, right? When in reality, like 80 or 90% of users are going to use like 10 features,
Yes.
right? So they're designing for like you can customize 500 things. And like that's sort of the problem there too. It's just not as accessible, and that creates some problems too. So some of it is like
Are there lessons from the
mentality.
model we're seeing there that we can apply here, or cities in Europe or cities in the East that you're seeing that you say, wow, what they're doing, if New York did that, we could really accelerate the pace of
Oh
adoption.
yeah, like I was before sort of like the wave of the last couple of years here. We build inroads with Copenhagen, with Amsterdam, with the Nordics in general, with
Yeah.
Helsinki,
Yep.
because with Stockholm, because they were very good at. In some ways, they're like if you have a really early technology here, it's easier to pilot it over there. Like historically,
Mm.
it might change now
Yeah.
because of everything we've been talking about and sort of the wave,
Yeah.
but they've always been good at doing like living labs. Like there's some great programs in Helsinki that do that. They're and they're very much sort of like the government's more innovative in a way there, right? Because it's more cleaned up. It's like if you go to Estonia, they have like everything is digital, all government's digital. Like here, it's still a lot of paperwork if you file for permitting, and like it's really complicated, not straightforward. And like there's no place where it gives you like step by step what you need to do.
Yeah.
It's all about like who you know and who you can get you sort of navigate through that. And you
Yeah.
have to pay to play kind of
Yeah.
thing. Where they're like some of those places were a lot more better at experimenting with piloting, with adopting new kind of solutions, particularly on the sustainability side. And it's partially because it's ingrained more into culture. Like Dutch have always been pretty open minded. That's been nature of that society because they were trading for centuries, and that's sort of like how that became a
Hmm.
thing. So there's that, and then Nordics have their own sort of culture where a lot of like sustainability elements are part of it. And
Yeah.
so it's been ingrained and that sort of functions that way. And then, a place like Switzerland is just the perfect example I give there. Switzerland is kind of like the US in terms of they're more in the capitalistic end of Europe,
Hmm.
but their tax code is very small. Like libertarians love Switzerland.
Mm.
If you talk to libertarians here, they love Switzerland because the tax code is very small.
Yep.
It's very like compared to here, it's not as like we'll add a new rule. They will update their constitution. They will update things for the modern times. And I think that's smart. That's what should happen here. But here, there's always a conflict with like the Constitution is written for a reason, even though it was written
Yeah,
over
yeah, yeah.
200 years ago. Uh, and
There's a lack of
you can't,
political will.
you
Yeah.
can't add new amendments. We haven't added that forever, and there no, but that's a broken system,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so that's a challenge here. The big roadblocks here are those kind of things. You're only going to be able to do so much. You're always going to have issues because of that. And so, you know, in some ways, like that's sort of
Well, it
yeah,
also kind of brings us full circle back to the lobbying conversation we were having with Uber or Airbnb, right? They start somewhere, they get big enough, now they have lobbyists. Now the legislation can be written to allow them to become the incumbents, right?
yeah,
And you can see that in anything. Why can't we
yeah.
have taxes on the back of a postcard? It's because there is a $1 billion tax industry here in this country.
Billionaires always had a leg up here. It's always been a thing,
Yeah.
and that's the thing. If you are employing strictly a capitalistic model, if you give everyone $100 over 50 years from now, like two people are gonna have pretty much all the money. Everyone else
Mm,
is not. You have to balance that over time, or
yeah.
else it's always going to be the case.
Yeah.
And you saw that in the 1800s with the railroad industry here, like the car industry, who bought up all the streetcars in the early 20th century, all those systems, and then tore it down because they wanted to build a monopoly for car centric, and that led to suburbia and basically Americans' addiction to having a cars,
Well,
for better or for worse.
there's a fascinating case study actually of Russia post the collapse of the wall. Um, all of these USSR public assets, right? Trains, rail yards, ships, nuclear submarines. All of these things had to go to bid to the public market. But what the government decided to do is say, we're going to give vouchers to every citizen, and you can go and own a piece of this asset. They're like, I don't need this voucher to own a submarine. I need food for my family. And what some enterprising people, most of them in the West and UK and places, came in and said, I'll buy your voucher. And all of these, what used to be public assets in the USSR, as part of the Russian Federation, basically became owned by like hedge funds. And it's such a fascinating experiment of like, yeah, what do people actually care about? They care about their day-to-day aspects, and it almost feeds into everything we've been talking about today of like why these things don't change. It leads me to actually something that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough, which you're probably one of the first people I've heard talk about this, that the climate transition also means a labor transition. And the fact that there is work that will need to happen in this city as we add more heat pumps for HVAC, or we add more EVs, or we, whatever, that new training has to happen. So talk to me about that belief, and what is EDC doing to help that
It's
transition?
not just a belief; it's statistically true. But
Yeah.
basically, like at a high level, right? And I'll break it down um, in terms of what we do now, what we're looking to do. So it's not the again, like if you go back to like, all right, we have goals. Like say by 2030, we want to reduce emissions by 50%, right? I think that's sort of the goal for the city right now. Um, from a technological perspective, it already exists. It's just a matter of implementing these technologies,
Yeah.
right? From a financial perspective, like you see all the money coming in now. It's not really that. I mean, there's some issues there where sort of financial instruments need to sort of be better coordinated between the private sector and the public sector, and sort of streamlining some of that and simplifying it, all of that. But the labor issue is the biggest thing. So, for instance, like take offshore wind, brand new industry to the US for the most part, right? Um, where do we start? How do we hire people? We don't want to, sure, we're going to have to import some specialists from, say, Denmark or Norway or Belgium who sort of know how to design and build and architecture, blah, blah, blah. But there's no academic programs here for that.
Mm-hmm.
At least like 2 or 3 years ago, there's no like training for it. Like the unions aren't doing anything on that yet, right? And so we have to figure that out, because like you can't if say a company like Equinor agrees that hey we're going to install these things by 2035, like you basically have to train people starting today,
Yeah.
right? How do you get electricians and construction workers upskilled for those things? Um, and that's across the board. So offshore wind, sure, one thing. And you can take lessons from say the oil industry. So Houston can say like, hey, we have tugboats, we have people who work on offshore oil drills. Like, there's probably some similarities there, right? Like how to build a rig versus an offshore wind station. The foundation, there's probably a lot of
Yep.
similarities. So of course, there's that, but like essentially you're starting from scratch. But you're all these other industries is the same thing, right? Building retrofits, um, EV infrastructure, um, even ag tech, I would say, is kind of a change, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
farming's getting
Yeah.
transformed in
Indoor
some
farming.
ways.
Yeah.
And so there's like if we try to look and there's some things. So NYCERDA has some pretty good like NYCERDA is the state agency for energy.
Mm-hmm.
And so they basically do a lot of projects from innovation to infrastructure. And they have some studies there where they're kind of doing like forecasts on labor and sort of the skills needed, but it's very much on the energy side. And then a couple states have it, but like there's no New York City data. Like
Mm-hmm.
what's the building retrofit market going to be here 20 years from now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or 10 years from now, let's say. And so we've been conducting a study over the last year to do that, right? And we're turning it to an action plan because in some ways, like what we want to do is say, and it's coming out this fall. What we want to do is basically say, like, okay, if you're an electrician, these are the pathways that you can go. These are the skills you need to get into those pathways, right? And when I say pathways, is can you go from an electrician, which is a great middle class job and pays six figures most of the time, to where, and you don't need a college degree, right?
Yep.
To being a general manager for that, to say working in the offshore wind industry or to building retrofits.
Yep.
And is it a certification? Do you have to upskill? What kind of institution should be doing that? How do we invest in getting material science postdoc PhDs here to research the next generation of materials where biotech and sustainability sort of collide? And so that full picture is one thing that we need to have, not just for us to sort of plan, but also all the workforce organizations across New
Yeah.
York, right? Because right now there's no clear guidance on that. There's no specific sort of saying like you need these degrees to do it. It's more like you network your way, you work your way into the climate space, blah blah blah. And it's a really fundamental issue because the point is you need to reach these climate goals. You're not going to do it if you don't train people, and you have to work backwards. If you it's 2030, you pretty much need to start today.
And there's already today shortages in a lot of those fields because as a country, we have not been emphasizing trade labor as something to be aspired to.
Mhm.
And you're right, because now we are expecting massive infrastructure changes, but we don't have the skilled labor to
And you
actually
don't
go
want to
after it.
import all the labor. I mean, there's a
Oh
certain
yeah.
extent that you want to do that because of expertise and
Yeah.
you want the best and whatever. But like, you have to train
Yeah.
this career, and that also sort of brings in the sort of how do you get New Yorkers into those jobs?
So actually that was my next question to you is like, how does anybody as a New Yorker who cares about making this city the hub for climate innovation and climate action and all these things that we've been talking about, like what can we do? Because it feels as one person that like you don't really have a lot of way to contribute. But if you care about these things, is there something that, one of our listeners who's a New Yorker can actually do to like help this process along?
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenging thing. There's a couple ways, right? I mean, I think on one hand, if you're like a entrepreneur or startup, or we see this a lot with like college graduates and things like that. I mean, and I'll get into some of the programs that we are thinking about,
Please.
but like, uh, some of it is like there's like multiple events a, a day here and on the climate space, right? And like, I know like meetup is not a thing anymore, but I think didn't we work start them or
Yeah,
something
there's a
like
whole
that? Yeah,
story
yeah, yeah.
behind it. Yeah.
But point is, it's like there's these communities, right? And like those are always great places to tap into, because you want the main thing in New York, at least, is like one of the advantages you have here is that it's easy to network
Yep.
because it's dense, because you can go to like multiple events, like with Climate Week. Yesterday was what, 8 or 9 events for me across the day. And
Did you make it to all 8? I'm very
yeah, yeah,
impressed.
yeah, with this in subway and public transportation. And so
Yeah.
like you can do that, right? Where again, if like you're saying you're in the Bay Area, like oftentimes you will have to drive
Yeah.
to get to places, and you're probably not going to
So it's worth
do that.
taking advantage of the proximity
So I
of
think
all this
well,
energy
I
that's
think it's an
happening. Yeah.
advantage in New York that we have to lean into,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like
Yeah.
totally, right?
Yeah.
So on one hand, there's that, right? I feel like there's it's you have to put yourself out there and meet people and connect. And I think that's general. It's climate space or otherwise. I feel like you have to hustle a little bit here, right?
Yeah.
It's not New York's not an easy place. It's tense. Like it's like you have to push. Um, so on one hand, there's that, and then on the other hand, a lot of things that we look at is, can we take, say, internship opportunities at CUNY, right? We've long legacy of doing this, where whether it's life sciences or climate space, like place them in startups across New York,
Yeah.
right? And what you end up seeing is oftentimes a lot of those interns get follow up work. They get to put this on their resume, gets them into the next stage, right? To actually get a job at a company. And, those are things where we want to dramatically increase that, right? Is there a way to sort of bring in more people to work in the government, right? Just for a little period of time, right? Maybe it is an internship or otherwise, to sort of get that experience, get that what I thought was a 2 month thing, right?
They
And
might get
actually
stuck for
be a
10 years
and
like you.
actually be a 2 month thing. Yeah, yeah. You know,
Yeah.
uh, and so there's definitely that side too, right?
Yeah.
It's not just like the startup game. It's like you need to immerse yourself in all these different pieces, and all of them are great options, right? Um and it's moving now. Now it's moving fast, and I think that the challenge is going to be that there's already like 6 different kinds of pilot programs now
Mhm.
in New
Mhm.
York, right? Everyone has their own, and eventually that's going to get standardized. And it's also hard to say quite yet, like, what are the best programs, right? For if you want to go into a space like this. Um,
But they're out there. The sort of bottom line is these programs are out there, and if you're a New Yorker that cares
yeah.
about being a part of this, it's really never been a better time.
Yeah. And, honestly, it's interesting. I got connected to uh, a bunch of people in the Bay Area that are on the workforce end. And a lot of them have like these was it like Climate Vine? There's like a bunch of like these like climate based, like a
Mhm.
lot of
Mhm.
online
Yeah.
resources, right? Which
Yeah.
is very much like a Bay Area kind of mentality. But I think it's good because they're building communities digitally across the country, across the world. And like this space, point is this space is you're gonna constantly have to network, because you can't just be a software startup and scale in the same way. It requires policymakers and government, and um, before you know it, you have to measure your scope 3 emissions, and there might be some certifications there, and like you're installing things in a neighborhood, so you have to build relations with communities. And so like these are all things that are like oftentimes new for people.
Yeah.
And there's a learning curve to it. And to me, the best way to do it is just start getting involved one way or another,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's just a lot out there.
Yeah. So I'd like to close where I usually do with a lot of our conversations, talking about causes for hope. But I'll ask the question a different way. I read a wonderful piece that you wrote in 2019 called "Designing for Democracy 4.0."
Yeah.
And I think it was shortly after the birth of your daughter, and
Yeah.
you were thinking about, I think, two things you mentioned in there, which is AI and climate change being kind of the two biggest challenges that we are going to face, or really is going to in the very near term. Sitting here 4 years later, everything that you've seen in really both of those fields, are you fundamentally more hopeful or more worried about those challenges?
Um, I don't know if I'm I don't know if I've ever been worried per se, because it is what it is, right? Like, I don't think oftentimes, in some ways, right? Like, I think that we're going to be slower to adapt to climate change than we think. Even like with American, like we're going in ultra speed. Like, people don't realize like what's ahead, right? It's not just say we can retrofit and we'll make it, right? And we're all going to make it. No, there's going to be mass global population movements, particularly from like developing countries, which is going to create crises in developed countries in terms of immigration, in terms of resources. Um, there's going to be any and even if become carbon neutral now, we still feel the effects of the last 10 years, so we won't really know. So it's just going to get incrementally worse. So in some ways there's going to be a massive change, right? And that's scary, and that's kind of the reality, right? It's dark,
Yeah.
and like, I don't read about climate change outside of my work, right? Like, I don't want to. Like, I'm basically like, completely in another world because I can't, right?
Yeah.
And so on one hand, there's that stark reality. But on the other hand, like, it's changed a lot over the last couple of years. And, I feel like humans are pretty are able to problem solve really well. I think it's just a matter of like, are we gonna all work together? Or because it's not gonna work if we don't work as a global society.
Yeah.
And that's complicated, and I don't have an answer necessarily how that works. But like, like New York will be fine. But again, it's like the same old story. Rich people will be fine. The poor communities are going to have harder challenges. There's less investment in there, because the capitalistic model doesn't really spread the love evenly. And so you're going to run into issues like that, but it's going to be nothing compared to, say, sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
or where there's going to be massive drought. I mean, you're already seeing now with all the sort of government collapses in the Sahel region.
Yeah.
Part of it is because, once things get bad, they get real bad. And
Real
then
bad.
that is a sort of point of change. So, I feel like that's sort of where we need to figure that out, because that's going to be a problem for not just them, but us as well.
Yeah.
And so, on one hand, I'm optimistic because I feel like now people are actually moving, and there's a lot of people that care, and a lot of people who are joining the quote unquote movement, whatever that is. But like, but I'm also very much a realist, and I know that it's going to get significantly worse before it gets better. And it
Yeah.
probably won't get better in my lifetime, which
Mm.
is, hopefully still another like 40, 50 years. Uh, we'll see. But, I'm at the halfway point. Uh, but that's the reality, right? And
Yeah.
like, I could be like sitting in in a room and like be like completely devastated over that. But like, It's it's
Or
gonna
or
happen,
or you can
right?
choose
Like,
to act, right?
what
Yeah.
there's nothing I can do about that, right? And the
Yeah.
same conversation, same point as you mentioned, like, how can I get involved? problem's too big, I can't solve it. Well, yeah, like not one person can solve this, right? Like not one person will make, but you can make a difference. You can get involved, like you can try. We have to try.
Yeah.
And there's going to be just a lot of issues that it's going to be a harder set of decades, right? Like I think, my mom always says this, it's like we screwed it up for everyone else because like uh they had it the best, right? Like the boomer generation had it best. Post World War II babies that are now in sort of their twilight years had it best because they dealt with the most stable global setting. Climate issues are really popping off now. That's the reality. We're gonna have to face a much more difficult world, you know.
You can choose to be kind of, turtle up about that and be sad about it, or like a lot of the entrepreneurs that you and I meet, like a lot of the people that are joining the movement. And look, I totally get it. I mean, I joked that the number of climate investors in New York this week that have never made a climate investment is at an all-time high, but it's a big tent and it's a
Yeah.
big problem.
And
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 you want to invite those people in because it's important for them to be
and
here.
some of the smartest people I've met um, in the last couple of years are people that haven't been in the climate movement until very recently. So like, why wouldn't we want more
Of
people in
course.
there?
Yeah.
Like, we need everyone. I don't care if someone's in it for the money. I really don't care. Like, as long as they're committed to trying to achieve some things, that's great.
Yeah.
Like, I don't care.
It's a
Like,
message of hope for all you cold-hearted capitalists out there from Sander Dolder. Sander, let's leave the conversation here. I think that's a really fantastic point to say. Instead of, I think feeling down about it, you can get activated and you can go out and be a part of the solution. And there's quite a few programs that we'll make sure that we list for our listeners to go out and get activated. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me and for sharing your experience and your wisdom with us today.
you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, that's it for this episode of Climb by VSC. Thank you so much for watching and listening. My thanks to my guest, Sander Dolder, for joining me on this show. Hey, did you know that you can watch as well as listen to episodes of Climb? You can find us on YouTube for full episodes, as well as on social like TikTok, Instagram, and LinkedIn for all of the clips. If you like this episode, please leave us a 5-star review. And if you love this episode, we'd love to hear from you on guests that we should have on the show. Well, that's all for now. We'll see you next week on Climb by VSC.